this case, the image itself is a package. This one was produced using the Golang image from Docker Hub. So that's lines 11 to 20 that tells you about that image itself. You'll notice that there are some tags. Okay, so the format is called tag value. That's what SPDX calls it. They are working on converting that to JSON at some point. So that's ongoing work for them. But tag value is the one that they, the format that their current validator works on. And then they have tools that convert this format to the other formats. So lines 11 to 20 is representing the image. Lines 22 to 26 represent the layers within the image. Now, I want to caveat this because we did have a conversation about having just one file system in a container image moving forward, or at some point, or I don't know, in the future. But basically what this says is that this image contains this file system, or this collection of file systems. And then lines 28 through, let me see, lines 28 through 64 represent the first one, the first layer. And lines 66 to 79 represent all the packages that come with that one layer. Now, the way you acquire that information can vary depending upon how you get that. That's beyond the scope of this topic. But then after that, there's the second layer, lines 81 through 118, and then the packages that are installed in that, and so on and so forth. So there's like a big line for each of those blocks are for each of the layers. And then here are the whole list of packages that come with everything. And so each of these blocks, say for example, lines 176 to 187 represent each of the packages. There is also a mechanism in which you can define all the files that come within the that come with the package. For container images, I don't think this is possible because you don't really know how the files map to the image layer unless you're making like one layer for one package. I'm not going to go into that at this time, but how you'd represent that in layers is that for example, for lines 123 to 137, that represents one layer in the container image. Under that, there will be a list of files, which are all of the files in that that are in that file system. So you could do it that way. And each of the files are represented in with the same tags, like the version and the license declared and the download location. The download location for all the packages is, if you don't know what it is, and if you don't know what it is or where it came from, then you'll need to put this string called no assertion, this guy. And that basically tells you like, yeah, I just ran some scripts and these are the files that were there. I don't know where exactly the source of this or the download location of this is. If you were using a package manager, you might be able to do that. Just say like just put in the package manager's binary repo. So you can do that for yes. So you could do that for all of the packages that you install that way. If it was a URL, then if it's a straight up URL, like how people would install the Golang binary, then you could put that in there as well. So anyway, in general, these are all the keys that could possibly go into your manifest. Whether you want to use SPDX or not, it at least gives you an idea of what you can put in there. At the end, there's a bunch of license definitions. It basically gives you an overall list of all the licenses that apply for that container image. So if you're going to distribute it and if you want to see if you can comply with some of the copyleft licenses that are included here, this is a nice way of bundling, like summarizing all of that. Okay, so that's what it looks like. And I am done with that topic. Does anyone have any questions?
I wish Tianan was here. He has written some of the tools that do outputs for the Docker IO library images that have various amounts of this information that he's basically put together his own format for. And he's done some shenanigans to be able to get to derive the download URL and whatever else. So the as far as the parser and everything of this, are you using an upstream SPDX parser for this tag word?
No, I had to make my own. So you mean
This,
so you mean
this text,
parsing?
this text, like this is like a defined format. Like I look at the SPDX website and it's got information about it, but
yep. So it is a set specification. You can generate documents that comply with the specification, and SPDX has parsers for this format. But if you're going to generate an SPDX document, they have a validator online, so you can test if your tool complies with SPDX. So that's basically how I did this: is create a generator that maps all of the ways that the tool itself defines these tags and maps it to this format.
Okay.
So some of the stuff I can't really get. Like, for example, one of the things that they want you to put in is this thing called package license concluded. What that means is what you have concluded as the license, but I feel like that is a very that's a very legal area to be in, and I don't think that any tool can really tell you that. So they require it to be in the document, but they understand that you may not know this, so you can put no assertion over there.
The license package license declared, is that something you are using like a library for? What is the method you took to be able to like fingerprint the license?
Okay. So this is actually big caveat with this document, which is that the license declared is not something that I would be able to come up with by just looking at whatever the package manager produces. So, like for example, this guy, it has a license. It says that there's a license ref and this other license ref. That's a license reference, and so if you look at that license reference over here, all it's saying is this is the original license. Basically, that's what the package manager told me it is.
Mm.
There is an issue on the SPDX tools GitHub repo that asks for a module that will convert these like declared licenses that package managers or developers use and map it to what SPDX wants. This has been implemented in some other licensing tools. The one that I'm thinking about is a tool called OSS Review Toolkit, and they have a module written in Java that does the mapping. So the issue is basically convert, like forklift whatever they've done and convert it into a Python module. And it is possible to convert that into a Go module as well.
Well, that's where, from my conversations with some of the folks with the Claire project, that I think they provide a bill of materials to some extent, and the fingerprinting of which license used is using some Python module, and it was like, maybe it wasn't Claire. Doesn't matter. It was within there, but still it was some upstream Python module, and it was like best effort, and they had to manually go back and curate it. So
Right. Yeah. It usually, I mean, the reason why I keep going back to SPDX is because they've looked at this for a really long time and they've had legal teams look at it. So they've kind of already done most of the effort, at least for the common ones that we see or the legacy ones that we see. So I would say like at least like 80% of the licenses are mapped. The other ones, it's basically like an issue submitted to them and them going to their legal team and saying, okay, what do you think this is? And the legal team comes back and says, like, our best guess is this. I mean, in the end, it's all best guess.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I like it a lot. I will.
Where can I find Tianan's work on
Well, that's
this?
a good question. Is it like repo info?
Which part specifically?
The repo info that Tianan and Pals produce. Here's one for like WordPress. I'll post it in the HackMD.
Okay, thanks. Do you know of anyone else who is working on this?
I know of folks within Red Hat that are actively doing similar to get it, not with SPDX, but for bill of materials. And so this is where they're looking at like attaching it to a manifest list so that it can be pushed to a registry like a multi-arc with a JSON piece, and potentially even having something that looks like a mock image. That the nasty part is, and this gets into some of the stuff we've talked about with like CNAB and otherwise with Lasker that is up next to speak. Part of some of the license compliances, like the GPL particularly, say that the source of the binaries must be provided in a like manner, which, if taken to the full extent, could mean that it ought to be served up on the registry as well, not just given like a pointer to the name of the source package or whatever, hopefully even the checksum, but the source must be provided in a like manner, which really tests the length of what folks have wanted to do with registries at this point. And I don't think anybody wants to just shove them all into a big tarball and duplicate space on the file, on the registry file system like that.
So one of the goals for Turn is to actually do that, produce the source in a like manner, but all it will do is use the package manager to do that, or make like, best effort to go and find it based on metadata that it finds. But that's kind of a long ways away.
For sure.
It's like baby steps.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
No, I like the looks of this, and I might have folks. I'll encourage folks to get the folks that I know of that are working on various plumbing pieces of this to get more involved here. But this is, like, I've tried to surface it here, that this is a relevant topic and really ought to be the place where that conversation is happening. So I think the point at which, and we need to yield to the next person, but the point at which they're working on is making sure that proof of concepts of pushing those potentially different MIME types, media types at different registries, and how best to handle it, and be a part of the conversation of like how to handle whitelist or blacklist of what MIME type media types can be pushed to the registry, so that the abuse of pushing additional JSON metadata and or additional archive types can be managed and not make an unmanageable situation.
Right. Okay. I will yield the floor.
So cool. Well, thank you for that. And during your call, during your presentation, I realized I was not recording yet, so I got it near the beginning, but we missed a few minutes at the beginning of the call. But this will be recorded and shared later. Okay. Lasker, will you give us the recap from the KubeCon meetings that you were a part of?
Yeah, thanks. So we had pretty good coverage. So I sent the notes, and I know there was a lot of concern about people that couldn't make it and wanted to be part of the discussion. So instead of just trying to summarize the notes, I did try to capture as much as I could about the conversation so people could understand what the thought process was around each one of those conversations, or each one of those suggestions at the end. The main thing, so some of it, for those that have been following along, it was that we kind of reaffirmed what we've been talking about, using the media type on the manifest. So that, and Vincent was just kind of talking about that. So today there's an OCI image that says that's what this manifest is. And then in the media, config object, there's a media type that pretty much says that this is also an OCI image config. And what we're saying is we want to use that to be other things like Helm charts, like singularity images, OPA, just like saying OPA, was some other ones that came up. And in fact, the build pack folks are also thinking about pushing a collection of image layers up that isn't quite a Docker file yet, Docker image, but it will be the layers that you can then update manifest and repoint to it. So there's a number of different scenarios around that. So that kind of continued the conversation we had there when we did the recap on why we didn't use the media type at the top of the manifest. And that was basically, we felt that everything that's in an OCI image manifest where it's the top-level config object and a collection of layers, was perfectly fine. Whether the layers were all tarballs, the layers don't necessarily have to be tarballs, and they don't even have to be ordinally indexed either for other artifact types. That's just the way the Docker/OCI image spec says they need to be for that media type. So all that was pretty good. It was good just to get everybody in the same room and walk through that. There was some conversation around, can you really push things that aren't TARs or things that aren't Docker images? You know, should these things just be something that comes from scratch? And we basically agreed that, look, there's no reason for it to come from scratch. If a Helm chart wants to store a single tarball, that's fine. But if they want to separate out the chart and the values and some other parts that they want to separate out as different layers, that's completely valid, because the expectation is a Docker or OCI client would never need to pull a Helm chart. That's the Helm CLI would pull the Helm chart. So all of that was pretty well accepted. We talked a little bit around using the config object to have custom schemas. I'm sorry, go ahead, Vincent.
Have you experimented with that besides just the RAS tool, but to see, because I'm pretty confident that there's broken assumptions in different tools that if you push those out, that in certain places, different media types are just assumed to be certain types of configs or assumed to be compressed or uncompressed archives.
Yeah, so
I'm all for that. I'm wondering what's the fallout of that broken assumption, or the assumption people have had up to this point.
No, it's a great point. So Gareth was testing this because he had pushed an OPA artifact up to ACR and then try to pull that tag from, so an OPA manifest is actually, they store them as Rego files, so it's not even a tarball. And it's open policy agent. It's a way to apply permissions to Kubernetes. So he's been experimenting with that, and what he did there was he ran the Docker client and said Docker pull or his Docker run and gave him that, the content addressable URL. So it was a demo, something or azure.io/OPA whatever with a tag, and the Docker client just said, hey, fail, right? There wasn't like it, exploded his hard disk and started sending, his secret somewhere. It just, the Docker client said, I don't understand what this is, and just gracefully failed. Didn't hang, didn't do anything special. And we also did the test on image index as well, because we'll talk a little bit more about the image index, but the index, basically the Docker client knows to pull this thing and look for architectures. And since it didn't find the architecture values, it says, I don't see anything. It's like it's just as if an ARM client tried to pull a multi-arch manifest that only had Windows and Linux. And it goes, I don't have one of those. So it just kind of proceeded and said, don't, fail. So far, we didn't write automated tests and do all the various scenarios, but so far we seem to be in a pretty safe place. We'll talk about the index config object in a minute, because that's the one that was more controversial, if you will. But what I didn't really cover was the interesting part was the way the people that were at the meeting. So we had Jimmy and Joey from Quay, and Claire stuck in my head, and they also talking about Claire, the security tooling. We had Maya from Twistlock and Gareth, who's now at SNCC. So we had security scanners. We had Mike, and Jimmy that represent, kind of the OCI stuff from the past. We had CNAB folks, and we had, we had CNAB and Helm folks. There are two artifacts that were using this. And we also had Ken there from JP Morgan. So it was nice because we had all kind of the representative groups that we need to worry about. And Harbor. Sorry, we had Daniel and Steve, I think his name is, from Harbor there as well. So we were able to kind of discuss the various purviews of it, and Ken was really happy about it, and he's been following us along the way because he's at JP Morgan and he's got to run, a private registry. I think he's running DTR. He's running JFrog. He's running I forgot the list, but he's like, you guys just keep on throwing more stuff for me to run. Can I have less things to run and still store these? So he loved the idea that the registries that he's already configuring and maintaining, whether it be on-prem or the ones he runs in the clouds, could just support more of these was, just golden for him. So that was that part of it. Let me just go back and look at the, were there any questions before I just go back and look at the notes?
Hey Vincent, did you have any specific clients in mind? Like I know that in Docker, we actually made it very restrictive on what the config values are like 2 years ago or so. In one case, I think we had to actually go in and make it less restrictive in order to even support the OCI images in a recent version of Docker.
I don't have example of that. It was actually Miloslav that you might have worked with in the past that had like immediate concerns. He like rattled off 2 or 3 points that clients pulling down either a config, they hardly check the MIME type of the config before they just try and marshal it in as an image, or even as in layers in the image, that they just pull it and expect it to be a tar archive, not even compressed or not. They don't even check.
I think Docker pre maybe 1.12, maybe even before 1.13 may have done that. But that was definitely added in.
And the other place was whether or not there was fail-safe logic, like not fail, but like a case and default statement for like what Lasker just mentioned, where it would walk down the list of manifests and look for its own architecture, unless it's been specified to fetch a particular one. But if it got to the bottom and didn't find one, then it would just use either the first or the last or something like that. And or if there's one without an OS and ARC specified, it would just assume that it's Linux AMD 64 would be another place that might make an assumption.
Okay, yeah, because I know some about kind of how older Docker works, but I figure most clients are either kind of one of the ones that Docker's using, or probably like Scopio or something. So I didn't know if you had specific issues you know about.
No, that's where I'm at this point. I've been encouraging folks internally that are going down this path to be like, start kicking the tires and finding where it breaks, because I think that's everybody's concern. Like backwards compatibility and everything else is that if we do start pushing out alternate media types in the manifest list or image index, and or something that looks and smells almost like an image, but the layers of that source image are objects that get shoved at the repo, like an RPM MIME type and tarball MIME type or whatever else, that are not layers actually. That if a client would make an assumption, a broken assumption somewhere and try and run it and fail unexpectedly.
Yeah, maybe at some point we should talk about kind of enumerating what some of those clients are. Like as I said, there's definitely a specific version of Docker we could go back to and say, anything before this is going to have really weird behavior that might not manifest itself until you actually do a Docker run.
That's fair. And that might be that smoking gun is the classic 113.1.
Yeah, it's kind of a disappearing problem.
That's fair.
So, okay, so that was the majority of the stuff at the manifest part, and we talked a little bit about the config object would be an escape route for people to use custom schemas in the config. And from a registry perspective, we were kind of looking at going, look, we probably in most cases don't need to know to look in the config. Like for Docker images, we do look for the architecture. So we could, and I say we meaning the registry of people that represent registries, if we need to go look into that because we decide there is something interesting that we want to first class that experience, then there's a well-known place to look at because it'll be in the config object and there'll be a schema associated with that. So we could on the big ones. When I say the big ones, the more popular artifacts, I think Quay is probably the one that does the most investment in specific types. So they might go off and do something like that, but it would not be a requirement to do it. That would be something that it's pushed in, and it's really up to the artifact tooling to handle it. And the registry just treats it as this opaque JSON file. That kind of brings us to the index part. So that's where we started getting into how do we represent things like CNAB or I don't know what to call the SPDX. Is that what it was? The thing you guys were just talking about earlier.
It's just a document.
Okay, but it's a document. So the document could be well, the interesting one is this the same one that you were talking about, Vincent, from a couple of weeks ago, where you wanted to actually make it a special layer? Or did you?
Very, very similar. I mean, like this is effectively, we're talking about the same thing.
Okay. So what I found interesting about this one, or the one that at least Vincent was talking about, are we adding new layers to an existing artifact type, in this case a Docker image? And that one feels, at least the structure we've been going at today is, well, then whoever does the Docker tooling would need to know how to deal with that, because we basically have been defining it as the layers are part of an artifact type, and that any tooling around that artifact would have to handle it. If you wanted to have a separate artifact that you pushed into the registry that was this BOM document, then that fits right into what we were just talking about. In fact, even an image index in its simplest form would have an index, and it would have an OCI image as the standard Docker image is one of them, but that image index would also have this other artifact in it, and it wouldn't have an architecture. The config media type would be SPDX, and when the Docker client's going down the list, it should find, oh, here's the Linux ARM, the Linux 64, and I'm just going to pull that and ignore the other doc file. But then this SPDX tooling could also pull that index and say, oh, I know what a Docker image is, and I know what the SPDX is, so it can correlate them together. So that one also kind of fairly fits in pretty cleanly. The ones like CNAB, and so far CNAB is the only ones, and I say that because I'm hoping to find another one so we can kind of test this, is a CNAB is a collection of things that the collection as a whole is a defined type. Because a CNAB, just using the cloud MSI kind of vernacular, it is a thing that says, hey, I am going to run an installation of things, and to run that installation, it has this invocation image that has the binaries, it has the Docker, it has the Helm client in it, it has the AWS CLI or the Azure CLI or the whatever tooling it needs to actually do the work. And actually, currently, it actually has the things it would deploy. It has the Helm chart in the invocation image as well. But what it doesn't have in the invocation image, which is a Docker image in most cases, it doesn't have the images that I'm deploying. So if I'm deploying an accounting package or WordPress, I'll just use WordPress as a better example. A WordPress deployment is, the container image that actually is WordPress, but there's also, is it MySQL? I always forget them. Whatever it is, there's some database that it deploys as well, and it would use an ARM template to deploy that. So if we look at the index, it would have, here is the image that represents WordPress. Here is the invocation image that knows how to run these things. And those are at least two. Whether the Helm chart and the ARM template are yet another artifact in there, it's almost irrelevant. Joey had a great quote, which is obviously not his quote, that it's how do you say it? 0 to 1 or 1 to many. There's no 2. Once you have 2, you might as well have n. So the fact that CNABs already reference an OCI image, a Docker image, and another image that is the invocation image, we already have 2. So if the index itself represents these things, then we need the index to actually say this thing is a CNAB. Because the only thing there's no expectation the Docker client would process the index. The expectation is the CNAB client, the Duffel client. There's a Docker app client, I believe. Take the Docker app one out because they kind of probably confused it. There's the CNAB client and the Duffel client and the Porter client that would know how to read that index and look for particular media types in the list to know how to operate. But from a registry perspective, there was also unanimous, support that we need to know what these things are. We don't want to just have arbitrary blobs stored, because in Quay's case, they actually do even more special casing or special value, we'll say special casing, to artifact types. So the place that we left was, what do we, do we just bring, we talked about a couple different answers, and to short circuit just for time, we basically said, look, if the config object works in the manifest, why don't we just put the config object at the index? And everybody's kind of stewing up a little bit, but we kind of acknowledge that does feel like the best pattern. Mike brought up that we should probably rev the schema of the OCI index to be a 2.1, so it's well known. And that's the larger, that is a larger one. And there's another one around foreign objects, but I'll go there after that. So thoughts on index config object?
Did you say that there was a registry that had these images with the indexing?
Yeah, so we've done this in ACR, Azure Container Registry, and I never heard back from Jimmy, because Jimmy thought that he has things blocked by default, so he wasn't sure if I don't know if any. Josh, did you check Quay by chance? I see Josh on the phone.
No, I have not.
Okay.
No.
So we need to go back and test Quay, but from a manifest perspective, ACR already supports it, and technically by definition of the distribution spec, even in the image spec, it doesn't say you can't have other types. It just so happens that all of us that implemented these from a registry spec perspective said, well, that's the only type we know about. We might as well keep things kind of tight. So we started opening it up. So now you can actually push any media type to ACR at the config object. And if we don't know what it is, we'll just put a generic icon next to it. If we do know what it is, because you've told us this media type is this string that says helm or says singularity, we'll show that. And if you give us a logo in SVG format, we'll show that in the registry as well. So I'll stop there. There was Vincent was kind of talking a bit before about how do we make it easy for registries to put these in. I want to table that conversation just because I don't want to overload the plate here.
I'll ask you later then. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Yeah, we're happy to kind of experiment with that. So back to the index part. That was kind of there's two big things, like the manifest config media type. We're good. It generally works. I've got a PR that I've been working on for distribution that explains how to use these, so it kind of provides a format to it. But the change, the bigger change is, do we want to rev the schema for 2.1 to put a config object in the index so that we can get the same expressiveness at index? And from a timing perspective, I'll address that too, just to put some context to it. When we started these calls, we were trying to get distribution out as 1.0, and we're trying to figure out what are the breaking changes that we need to get in now so we can get the spec out. The catalog API, we discussed that's way too big. We don't need to put that in 1.0. It's easy to add in later. If we happen to get it done in time, great, but we're not going to make any dependency on trying to get the distribution spec 1 out, waiting for that. This one, I would like to get this conversation kind of done, because if we do not do this, there'll be strange things that wind up getting done. There's the CNAB to OCI one has a bunch of annotations, and we kind of had pretty good consensus amongst all of us that it's very nervous for us to have to represent things that way. They're very optional. They're not very well defined. They're great for search content, not at all about definitively knowing what this type is. So anyway, I think
this is clear. When do you want to wrap up the sort of time for comments? What's your timeline looking like when you want to open this PR?
Sorry, the PR that what we were just talking about that I posted there for the distribution stuff?
Yep.
Great question. So I actually was trying to figure out, we're all trying to find time for this. So I got some stuff done. What I was wondering if I should start it as a PR, like actually open a PR against distribution so we can start making comments. And I could just continue iterating on the spec, or should I get the spec done further, sorry, the PR done further before I open the PR? I was open to suggestions there.
What's the PR to distribution? I mean, I see some suggestion about a change to the image spec.
Yeah, so, well, no, it's, yeah, I didn't realize that image spec actually was already 1.0, and the more we thought about this, these are really not changes to the image spec, because we're not trying to change the format of what things that are trying to run container images. What we're really doing is saying registries that can store container images can also store other artifact types that use the schema of the OCI manifested index, but the content is actually different. So I'm actually working on a PR that's actually on distribution. I haven't opened the PR. I forked it, and I've been making the edits there. That's this other link that I put in the hack doc, and I pasted it here. So my question is, should I open a PR in distribution to get the review process going there, or do we want to just start with feedback in this branch, this forked repo first? And Claire, since you were asking, do you have an opinion?
I mean, I'm fine if it gets opened up on the OCI repo and let people comment there. I'm just trying to get a timeline so I can browbeat the folks on the ECR team to actually read it and provide comments for you.
Gotcha. Okay. So it'll probably help you if it's in the OCI GitHub registry, GitHub repo, as opposed to an Azure CR GitHub repo.
Yeah, I think it'd be nice.
Okay, fair enough. Vincent, are you okay with that, or Mike?
Yeah, open up an issue on the image spec to start revving the change for the media type config that you were looking for. That pattern seems to be fine on image index since it's already been done on manifest. I think, Vince, the issue they were having was trying to map what they're doing to annotations, a non-first class kind of thing. I think we need to look at it. This is a generic pattern for how you can extend index. Okay, and since we've already done this pattern on manifest, it made sense to at least discuss it there in image spec.
Okay.
And yeah, that would also push it over to distribution.
Oh, you said image spec. So you want me to do it, the issue on image spec, not just on distribution spec?
Well, where we define the specification for for where you're going to want to put that new type is actually over on the image spec, right? But yeah,
Distribution spec doesn't define any media types.
Right. It references them, but it doesn't define them.
Right. Well, it kind of defines. It actually defines the ones for the Docker OCI image. Like when the Docker client is running it, it does define what is the schema of the config object and the elements of it.
There's an example there. Yeah, there's an example there, and it references it, but it's not an actual the actual spec for it. So when I was saying rev it up to 2.1, I was really talking about the Docker schema 2 plus an addition for the new type.
Okay.
But I meant on the image spec, not on. What do you think, Vince? And Derek?
I'm not in disagreement with anything that anybody said here as far as like the process of opening a PR and all. I was actually trying to balance time of I wanted to hear Rajat's update as well on the next topic, but we're right at time.
I can ditch the third one that I have because I think that ties into your topic anyway, the call to action. We can talk about that later. It doesn't have to be today.
Cool. I might send out just a more formal email on that. as well.
Okay. So I know we're at time. What do you want to do from here?
I'd like to see, like they just said, a PR there, and as far as the media types for image index, that's part of a conversation that I think should turn into almost like a negotiation between APIs of how to have extendable media types, because bumping the image spec every time we have a different media type is silly. But that's something we didn't account for before.
Yeah, I mean, to clear, the pattern that we've come up with, and this is why I actually, and I know we're at time, so I'm trying not to go in too deep, but the idea is that the image spec is actually for Docker images. It just so happens that format we could use. The thing is, distribution is the thing that is receiving these things. We want distributions to be able to receive things that look almost exactly like these, except this one piece that says, these two schemas for a manifested index actually represents something else, but all the processing you do to validate the schema of a manifested index is perfectly fine. It just so happens when you get this thing, there'll be a string on the config object that says, this is actually a Helm chart. And the media types for even layers might be slightly different. But from a registry processing, when a push has happened, effectively of a push, we don't need to do anything special. It just works. So that's why I think there's a little confusion on whether it goes into the image spec or the distribution spec. And I think when these were both written, they were all about supporting this one artifact type, which is an image. And we're now saying that same infrastructure works for things that are not container images. And how
so the index and the manifest that are part of the image spec, I mean, that was just kind of where they went because, yeah, as you said, like there was one type that image config is really what the image spec is. But I mean, I think we should think of the index and the manifest as intended to be generically defined. We did want to get one change in, but it was going to be too much, which was to rename the layers key to just a generic references. But I think that's kind of, I think we should point it there, and just because it's called image spec, that doesn't mean that the index and manifest types are specific and can only be used for images.
Okay.
That's a good point, Dirk.
So we're starting to get over it, and any more conversation will just keep on going. There'll be more around it. So we can maybe defer it to next time. I'll keep on working on the PRs, and there was another piece that we wanted to bring up around these foreign artifacts, but that'll be a whole other can of worms. I know we don't have time for.
Right on. Cool. Good recap. We are over time for anybody that needs to drop. Rajat, I would like to hear what you have to say on the hooks front, as well as it's in the notes, so we can that link will get shared as well.
Okay. Well, if I could take for less than 1 minute. Short summary, the
Sure,
work was already
please.
done. The discussion was already happening, has already happened. The work has been put up here. They would look at the link, and the short summary is that we have definition of a pre-start hook, which is rather confusing. And so we're proposing that instead of the pre-start hook, which we should deprecate, we should have a mount hook and a start hook. And the PR kind of details that. I want action on it. I mean, we've done enough discussions. We have reached a conclusion. We have made the PR. We need the change in the spec. If people could just go in and upward, downward, squash it or promote it, we would need a closure on this one.
All right, I will make note of that as well, because I think a lot of the runtime folks it's largely down to, I feel like Alexa is the maintainer that's most involved there. I say that I think I'm still a runtime maintainer as well. The reason I'm deferring a lot to them is because they're also maintainers on RunC, which I'm not a maintainer of. So seeing the brass tacks of how it affects the different runtimes, I'm deferring to the maintainers there to feedback.
Okay, so I can follow that up,
I will-
and we somehow need to pull the trigger this way or that. I think it can't stay like in this state forever.
A limbo, yeah.
That's all.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.
All right, I will add that in the notes. Anybody else, feel free to add minutes to the HackMD doc as well, and I will send out links to things shortly. I thank everybody for joining. I will not be able to join next week and possibly the week after, so over the mailing list, or otherwise we'll coordinate somebody to help facilitate meetings if as we put them together. So thanks everybody for joining, and I'll see you online.
See you, man.
Thanks, folks.